everyone. Welcome back to She Birds Podcast. I'm your host, Brooke Nichelle, and today's guest is Simon. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Brooke. How you going?
I'm great. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
No, thanks for having me. Looking forward to having a chat about all things men's mental health.
Yes, thank you so much. I have men come on here to speak about men's mental health, but it's rarely, maybe like five, maybe
Yes.
five, because men don't really speak about their mental health. So, can you share your story, a little bit of your story?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess to set the scene, I'm a social worker here in Australia. So if you can't work out the accent, that's where it comes from. And I have a private practice. So I support men with their mental health and disability every single day. That's my job. It's my dream job to work in this space because for 30 years or so, or maybe over 30 years, I've lived with my own mental health challenges as well. And along the way, I kind of wanted to work in the mental health space. It took a long time to get here. I think, 15 years and a different career before I finally got into the mental health space. So I'm really excited to be here. But yeah, I've got a mental health story like a lot of people do. And, started roughly when I was 8 years old and I was in the schoolyard and another student said to me, Simon, if you stop using your voice for more than a minute, you're going to lose your voice forever. Now, this sounds like a really funny, quirky thing to say from one student to another, but something in my brain held on to that. And so this is my entry into mental illness, and it's obsessive compulsive disorder. So for anyone who's not sure what OCD is, you might have heard of OCD. It's often not really understood or misunderstood. A lot of people think that it's just excessive washing your hands or keeping everything neat and tidy. There's certainly elements of OCD there, but that's not me. I wash my hands normally like a normal person would. My house is a mess because I have two little kids. So that's certainly not me. But what mine was before I start, I'll define what OCD is just to help contextualize that. So when someone with OCD experiences that, it starts with an obsessive thought. So this is the O, and it's an intrusive thought. So for me, it was this thought or this fear of losing my voice, and I didn't want that to happen. I was a very happy kid, and I joked a lot. I mucked around a lot. I was laughing a lot, smiling, and so the thought of losing my voice really petrified me. And so to alleviate the distress that comes with that for an OCDer is to perform a compulsive behavior or a compulsion. And it's essentially an act. You have to do something physically or mentally to alleviate that distress. And so I started humming to myself. And so every other minute I'd go, hmm, hmm, hmm. In my internalized, it was very quiet. Nobody ever said, Simon, why do you make that noise? So I must have done it really quietly. And what that did was it reassured me that my voice still existed, that it still worked. And I was like, whew, every time I did that, I'm like, yes, my voice is still working. I haven't lost my voice. And I did this kind of obsessive compulsive behaviors for about 2 years. That was my entry into OCD. And it certainly evolved over time, multiple times. But I guess the most prominent time that it evolved was around 13. Mum and dad separated. And me and my little brother, so I've got three brothers, me and my little brother, we went out with mum. And so we became a single parent household in an area that was a bit, rough around the edges. It was a lot of drugs, alcohol, crime, you can name it, unemployment, a lot of welfare. So it was a lower socioeconomic area that we moved into. And I became really scared. Like there was this notion back then, and this is the 80s, 90s, noughties that we're talking about, that you had to have a man of the house. And so I put that upon myself to become this man of the house. And this is where OCD really ramped up for me. And in order to, well, I had this fear, should I say, that I needed to keep everybody safe. And I had this fear that somebody was going to either break into our house and steal our stuff. We didn't have much as a single, parent household. They were either going to steal our stuff, they were going to kidnap us, they were going to murder us. Pretty full-on things going through a 13-year-old's brain,
Mhm.
essentially. And to add on to that, also feared that the house was going to burn down while we were sleeping or when we weren't home. And so in order to alleviate these really distressing thoughts for a 13-year-old, I would perform excessive checking of the house to make sure that everything was safe and secure. And that would look like, at the end of the night, everyone's gone to bed. My mum, my brother, I'd go to bed, and then my brain would kick into gear, and it would go, okay, Simon, it's OCD time. Go check out this house. And so I'd go up to the front door, and I'd touch the front door, and I'd wobble it, trying to hear that it was locked. Like, if you push your hand up against the door, you can kind of tell if it's closed. If it's a little bit open, it might jiggle or wiggle and make this like little open sound. But no, I wanted to make sure that was fully closed. Then I'd go around all the windows, and I'd open up the curtains, and I'd check that the windows were fully closed, and locked if they had locks as well. And then I'd draw the blind so that nobody could see in the house as well,
Oh, wow.
and go around all the house. And, for people listening, they could go, oh, well, that's pretty normal. Most people do that when they go to bed. But I'd go to bed, and my brain would go, Simon, did you really check that door? Or did you really check that window? And then this was one of the more distressing ones, in the act of touching that door or touching that window, somehow you've miraculously unlocked it and it's popped open. So that front door, for example, we're touching it, trying to hear that sound, it might have popped open when I walked away. And so my brain couldn't say to myself, Simon, you've checked it, it's okay. My brain said, Simon, you are unsafe. Someone is going to get in and do all those nasty things. And so I would have to get out of bed again, and I would have to go to that door or that window, check that, and then I'd have to do the whole process again. So every door, every window, outside gates. It even went out into outside to check the car, that was all locked up and secure as well. And then the fire component is around checking the irons off and the stoves off and the ovens off. We had this big fridge, really old fridge. It was secondhand, and it had one of those, a fridge seal that was literally an inch thick, and it was really old school. But the seal had started to come away from the door, and so it closed, but it never felt like it was fully closed, because the seal was kind of like a bit broken. And so the obsessive thought around that one was that if it was slightly open because the seal wasn't properly closed, that the motor of the fridge would burn up and heat up and then overheat and then create a fire. And so checking that as well with this weird thought, these days, unless that fridge had a really faulty motor, I could go, you know what, it's not going to burn down, it's fine. The food might go off or whatever, but that's fine. But the 13-year-old version of me thought that we were going to burn down. And so that would add to it as well. So I'd be checking all these things that could catch fire. And this is where, and this one particularly, that's stuck with me. I said the other one lasted for about 2 years. This one lasted for 10 plus years. And in fact, I still do it today. I'm a 40-year-old man today. I still do it. But the good thing about it these days is that it doesn't take me 3-4 hours to go to bed like it did when I was a 13-year-old. Because I'd go to, do these rounds, I'd check everything, I'd go to bed. My brain would say, Simon, you haven't checked something, or something's happened. So I'd get up again. 3-4 hours later, I'm finally falling asleep in bed.
Wow.
Because I'm doing this excessively. And this is where I guess depression comes into my life as well, is I was exhausted doing this every single night. And the thing is, nobody knew I did it. I did it when everyone went to bed. My brother, my mum never said, Simon, oh, why are you checking all this thing? You go to bed, it's okay. Like, I did this in the dark, in a time before mobile phones and walking around with lights on your phone and all that type of stuff, in the dark. And it petrified me. Every night I would go to bed petrified. And then I'd wake up. And so if I had to lock the house up, maybe I was catching the bus to school or something like that, I would have to do the same rounds. And it would get to the point where I'd even leave the house and might have gone 20 minutes down the road and have to turn back to go check something, because my brain said, Simon, did you really check that? Because if that door's open, that mystery person who's going to do all these nasty things to you could be waiting for you when you get home. And so all these things petrified me. I'd go to school and I had my backpack on with all my school books and my wallet and my keys, and I would have to obsessively check, have I got my books, because I feared getting in trouble from the teachers if I didn't have my books. And also, do I have my wallet and keys? Because my wallet's got a card on it with my address on it, like a student card or a when I got my license, my car license, it had my license address on it as well. But also my keys. So if somebody, this mystery person, got my wallet, they'd know where I lived, so they can steal our stuff and do all these nasty things. But they'd also have my keys, which would be the means to get into the house. So to alleviate that distress, I would pull the backpack off my back as I'm walking to school, or even, this was in the same when I was, in my professional career, and I still do it this today, is I check, have I got my wallet and my keys in the front pocket, and then I'd put my bag back on. Yep, it's all good. And then 2 steps later, my brain will go, "Oh, Simon, did you really check that? Are you sure you checked that?" Take it off again, do it again, and then put it back on my back. And then my brain would say, "Simon, in the process of checking that, it fell out." And so off
What?
it goes again, and constantly. So the brain in an OCD brain is not just like you like things neat and tidy. It's not just that you like to wash your hands. It is driven, the behaviors that you do is driven by these obsessive thoughts that you just can't get rid of a lot of the time. And so I live with this, and then anxiety come along for the ride as well, like a generalized anxiety. I mean, OCD is considered for a long time as an anxiety condition, and
Mm,
I think that anxious and the anxiety in it was just me fearing the world, becoming that man of the house. But I guess the challenging part was that I couldn't talk about it, and like most boys and men, I grew up in the 80s, 90s, and noughties, and I work with guys that are older than me. I work with guys that are younger than me, and it's very similar across multi generations. It's this notion of boys and men can't share their emotions
yeah.
because you've got to be tough, you've got to suck it up, you've got to carry on. And so I didn't know how to talk about what was going on. I feared talking about it because I didn't want to be looked at as someone who was weak or girly or gay. These were the kind of labels that you might get, particularly when I grew up. And I didn't want to be labeled or anything like that. I wanted to be seen as tough and strong and with it. But it was really, really challenging. And so around 15, 16, I discovered alcohol. And initially, alcohol was fun. I was able to let my hair down, joke around, and muck around. It coincided roughly around the time that American Pie, the movies, all came out. So I love those movies, and I love the college, party atmosphere. That was something that we don't really have here in Australia. And so I'm like, oh, that looks really fun. And so every time I went to a party, I would try to emulate this American Pie kind of culture of drinking, pretty much like Stifler. If you could put me as to a character, it would be Stifler, and just tried to just be this party animal that was having fun, that there was no care in the world. It took a long time for me to realize that I was doing that because I was trying to hide away from this OCD stuff that was going on and the depression. Because when I drank, alcohol obliterated all of my thoughts, my feelings, these behaviors. I didn't do these behaviors when I was drunk because I'd drink and I'd drink and I'd drink to the point where I'd get drunk and then I'd go home and go to bed. And then it would be a really good night's sleep because I'd be passed out. But then what would happen is the next day the brain would go, okay, Simon, you've had a few hours off. Here I am again. And we're going to go into overdrive and we're going to start ruminating about the night before. And so this was my entry into what's called pure O. So this is pure obsessions, where the compulsive behavior is thoughts, it's thinking, it's repetitive thinking, and it's like a cycle, like a hamster wheel in your head. And so what I would do is I would think and think and think about the night before, because I wanted to check that I hadn't said anything that was going to offend somebody. I didn't do anything that was going to cause somebody else harm. And a lot of OCD is you doing things to prevent harm for yourself and harm for others. We have this really big fear that the absence of our behaviors is going to cause harm, distress, and that harm could be physical, it could be mental, it could be financial, a whole range of different things. And I would be replaying these nights in my head, trying to make sure that I didn't cause harm to somebody else or distress to somebody else. And what would happen with that is I would think so much that I would actually lose track of what was reality, what really happened the night before, and what was my OCD brain trying to tell me it was happening the night before. So my thoughts would become distorted and I'd lose track of that. And that one in particular, stayed with me for 25 years. I would drink for the next 25 years after about 15. And it would happen at the workplace. So when I became an adult and I got into work, and I'd go to those Friday night drinks and I'd let my hair down, and it's really cool. It's really fun. I'd probably have way too many drinks and I'd get on the dance floor. I'd be one of those work colleagues, and everyone would be like, look at Simon, he's having a lot of fun. But the next few nights, or next few days after that, and nights, I would be thinking and thinking and thinking about that night at the drinks. and it would cause a lot of distress for me. But then also, this is where somebody else finally started picking up as to something was going on. And so what we're talking about here is 20 years, from 8 to 28, that all this was undiagnosed, it was untreated, nobody picked up on anything, nobody said anything. But now I was living with my now wife. We weren't married at the time, and she's picking up on me thinking about these Friday night drinks a lot and going, "What's going on, Simon? Yes, you are drinking too much. You need to cut back. But you're doing this thing where you're thinking and thinking and thinking. You're overthinking about this night. Maybe you need to go talk to someone." And this is 2012. Finally probably had the idea that there was these things called mental health conditions out in the world. Before that, didn't know what mental health was, didn't know what mental health conditions was. The only thing in relation to mental health that I'd ever heard of was suicide, and that was because one of my friend's sisters had died by suicide. I didn't know that was interrelated with mental health conditions. And so this was the first time that we'd started conversations in my household about my behaviors and my thoughts and my feelings, and maybe needing to go and speak to someone. And so 2012, I finally went to see a GP, and I remember the words coming out of my mouth were very hard to say. And I said, "I think I've got a mental health condition." And I choked on those words as they came out. I'd never said those words. I'd never really thought those words either. And we did a few questionnaires. They call them the K10, so it's the Kessler Psychological Distress Scale. A lot of people who have been to a GP might have done those 10 questions or 12 questions. And that indicated that I'd been living with some psychological distress. And so the next step for me was, in Australia, we're lucky we can get these things called a mental health care plan, which gives us subsidized visits to a psychologist or a social worker or a counselor. And off I went. I went and saw a psychologist. And we had a bit of a chat. We did some more questionnaires, and she said, "Okay, Simon, what you're presenting with, what you're telling me about your life, there's a few things that we need to talk about, and one is depression. You certainly are living with depression. The next one is anxiety, so generalized anxiety. I can see that, in what you're saying and what you're presenting with." And then she said, "Alcohol, you drink way too much alcohol, like a young guy, and you need to cut back. So we need to talk about that." And then the last one was, "You've got this, you meet the diagnostic criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD." And I'm like, I have no idea what that is. And so I didn't really know what that was for another probably 8 or 9, 10 years later, really, because even though we're diagnosed with that, or I was diagnosed with that, nobody treated it. So I'd been to psychologist after psychiatrist, after counselor, after social worker, after life guru. I've been to them all. And even though I'd say I've got this thing called OCD, they would say they wouldn't treat it. They'd treat the depression. They'd treat the alcohol misuse. Actually, they would we'd talk a lot about that type of stuff. And so nobody treated the OCD. So I kept living with it. I kept doing all these quirky things. And what I've come to realize is that OCD is often considered a silent condition. It's a condition that on average takes about 13 to 15 years from first symptom to first treatment of OCD. And that's because those thoughts that we have, like the humming thing, like losing my voice, or like the house burning down, or and there's quite a lot of dark and type of thoughts that I've also had along the way, that they are so distressing to talk about that we hide away from them. And there's not really a lot of therapists out there that are trained in OCD treatment, who really understand OCD, because it is so misunderstood. It's often trivialized. You hear a lot of people say, "I'm a little bit OCD," or "I'm so OCD." And often they have no idea what OCD actually is. And so it took burnout in 2020. So COVID happened. I was studying my Masters of Social Work. I was still working in a full-time job. I had 2 kids under 3. A lot happening in 2020 for me, and I burnt out. I hit a mental, physical, spiritual, emotional wall. It took about 4 or 5 months off my work. And through this, I felt this overwhelming need to start sharing my story, because I'd been holding on to it so tightly, like a mask. I was under a mask. I've seen a few therapists, but I hadn't really shared my story with anybody else. And I just wanted to start talking. And so I started, an Instagram page for Mindful Men, and started sharing about, OCD and burnout and depression, and what it's like for a dad to live with 2 little kids under 3, and drinking and all that. Actually, I didn't talk about drinking until recently. And I got a lot of energy out of this. But what I found through Instagram is other people that lived with OCD. And I'd never known other people were out there with OCD. I thought I was the only person in the world who experienced these distressing thoughts and were doing these weird behaviors. And I'm like, oh, this is really cool. And so I started following some people and more people and more people. And then they started talking about this thing called exposure response prevention. I'm
Oh.
like, "Oh, what's this?" And what it is, so if we think about mental health treatment, we think about generally cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT.
Mhm.
That is the most research, the most evidence-based therapy. And what that does is it looks at your thoughts and your behaviors, and it tries to program your brain to relook at those thoughts and change your thoughts so that it ultimately flows on to changing your behaviors. That's the concept in very basically in CBT. ERP, and this is for OCD. So I'm saying a lot of acronyms now. So exposure response prevention, what it does is it doesn't try to change your thoughts because an OCD brain will have the thoughts regardless, and they're very hard to tackle because they're often intrusive. We don't know when an intrusive thought's going to come.
Mhm.
But what we want to do is prevent the behavior, because what the behavior does is it reinforces the thought. So, for example, me humming to myself reinforces the thought that I was going to lose my voice.
Mhm.
And so what we want to do is prevent the behavior. So that's why it's called exposure response prevention. We're preventing the response. So I discovered this after burnout, and this is around, only a couple of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And I found a therapist that did this on the Sunshine Coast where I lived, and it changed my world. It really did. It enabled me to take control back from my OCD brain. And so
Mhm.
those 4 or 5 hours a night checking everything, what I could do is start to check less or change my checking behavior, because often, like with an OCD brain, you're checking things like in a particular order. So for me, around the house, it might be the door number one, the window number two, the curtain number three, et cetera, et cetera. But ERP enabled me to start checking things outside of that order. So instead of my order being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it might be 1, 2, 4, 5, 3. So I can start zigzagging around the house instead of going around in a circle. And then
Oh.
over time, if I'm feeling really well, I could tackle that and actually cut out one of the numbers. So 1, 2, 4, 5, and get rid of number three. And this was huge for me because for the first time since I was 8 years old, and I'm talking now, I'm in my late 30s, I'm able to, with the support of a therapist who was specializing in OCD, I was able to stop doing a lot of these behaviors. I was able to take back control, and I absolutely love this. And so this gave me a lot of energy to know that I can stop surviving and I
Mhm.
can move into more of a thriving mindset. I was just existing before, surviving, getting through. Alcohol was still numbing everything for me. But
Mhm.
now I had this tool through ERP that I could start living my life and thriving. And so that's what I've been on since 2020, is this thriving mindset, which
Mhm.
ultimately also turned into me getting sober at 40. And what that did was, that's about just over 7 months now, since I've been sober, is I was able to put the beer down, and well, I was able to look at the beer to start with and go, I'm using this to mask still. I'm using this to heal or to have a safety blanket to stop these thoughts
Mhm.
around OCD. And what it's doing though is it's increasing my OCD, it's increasing my anxiety, it's increasing my depression and sense of loneliness. If I can cut this out and go against the cultural trend in Australia to drink and drink and drink, and I
Mhm.
still had that American Pie mindset in my head, if I can get rid of all of this type of stuff, I can actually cut back on the alcohol. In fact, get rid of the alcohol, start feeling healthy again, start to be able to use my brain to its fullest potential, and not just rely on alcohol to numb everything. And so that's where I'm at the moment, is thriving through mental illness, and I've glossed
Mhm.
over 35 years roughly of challenge and so forth, and I'm happy to unpack any of that as if you like.
Wow.
But move through from that survival to thriving mindset, and a few things that have prompted me along the way. Certainly, my wife, she's been there for me from day dot. She's helped me realize that I needed to go and speak to someone to start with. She's put
Mhm.
up a lot of my stuff all across the years as well, my challenges. And having kids has certainly helped. They've really put a spotlight on a few things, particularly the alcohol consumption. Associating me, having chats with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds about alcohol, and drinking on weekends and not drinking and driving. Like that didn't sit well with me. So I'm glad that they've come into my life and
Mhm.
helped me realize that. But also as a therapist, what I was doing is I felt like I was living a double life. So I'd say, for example, to my clients, you've got to cut back on the drinking, you've got to cut back on
Mhm.
drugs. But then I'd go home and do the same. And I think what that highlights is that therapists
Mhm.
are human too. We do have those same struggles. And that's why I love calling myself a lived experience therapist, because I can say, yeah, I've been there and I've done that. I've
Mhm.
drank until I've been, until to get rid of all my feelings, or I know what it's like to grow up in an era where you're told to suck it up, don't talk about your emotions, to bottle it all up. And
Mhm.
these are some of the challenges that men that I work with all face over multi generations. Is this notion that we've been brought up in environments where we're not allowed to share and not allowed to talk. We're often told in 2024 that we're the privileged ones, and men are the privileged, and
Mhm.
particularly me, I'm white, I'm middle class, from a Anglo-Saxon background, I'm heterosexual, like I have all the privilege in the world, right? But
Mhm.
it doesn't mean I don't experience challenge in my life. And so this is what I love to highlight through podcasts like yours and
Yeah.
the Mindful Men podcast, is that guys do struggle, and we
Yeah.
don't have to fit into this box that society has created for us, that we have to be tough, strong,
Mhm.
hard. We can actually be soft, vulnerable. We can be more feminine and still be manly at the same time. And so there you go, 35 years unpacked, and happy to answer any questions. But once I get started, I get so passionate about this. But I never. This was a struggle years ago.
Mhm.
But by sharing and sharing and sharing, I get more and more energy. And this is what I love about the work that I do now as a therapist, is just talking is so cool. It's good to
Yeah.
talk about your emotions and feelings, and hopefully inspire someone listening to go, you know what?
Mhm.
I do this weird humming thing too, or I think about this certain way, or I'm using alcohol to numb my feelings too. So maybe if Simon can do it, I can do it too. So there you
Yeah.
go, Brooke. I just rambled on for a little bit. Let's have a bit of a chat about it if you like.
Definitely. So I want to say, like, I did not know that OCD was that extreme. Like, I thought it was just people just say, oh, they're just paranoid. Like, that's what they usually say. It's paranoia. Because I do
Mm.
the same. Like, not to that extreme though, but I've done that. Like, check things and check my doors and, like, been, I guess, paranoid. I don't know. But that's what I experienced.
Yeah, it certainly is, and sometimes I go, "Am I just being paranoid?" But it's not being able to
Mhm.
let go of the
Yeah.
obsessive thought. Like, a lot of people can get an intrusive thought, and we all get intrusive thoughts. They're actually quite common,
Mhm.
but they can let them go. It's like a leaves on the stream, as you're doing your therapy, studies and so forth. There's this concept in acceptance and commitment therapy called leaves on the stream. It's kind of like clouds in the sky as well. It's like
Mhm.
a leaf will come in as the intrusive thought, but if you sit with it and let it go, eventually it goes down the stream and it disappears.
Mhm.
The OCD brain holds on to that. And there's different themes for OCD. So we touched on cleaning your hands
Mhm.
excessively. And so what that comes from is I don't have this theme, but other people certainly do. And this is one of the most commonly known ones, is this fear of contamination. So they call it contamination OCD. And it's the fear that you might get a germ and either ingest food or something like that and get very sick and die.
Mhm.
So is that extreme? Or, and this is where it goes to the harm on others, it could be that you inadvertently pass that germ on to someone that you love.
Mhm.
They get sick and then they die. So
Yeah.
it is very extreme. And so that's why they're washing their hands. And to an extent, that's why often they're cleaning the house excessively,
Mhm.
because they need that because of the contamination. There's harm OCD, and this is probably where my OCD comes in. It's harm OCD that your behavior or the absence of your behavior might cause harm to somebody else. And that could be, as I said, physical, financial, it could be emotional, it could
Mhm.
be death. So, for example, one of my things was, if I don't pull my handbrake on in my car, or the park brake on really, really tight, and if there's a slight incline in the street wall with a park where it is,
Mhm.
that car is going to roll down and smash through a house, like you see on the
Oh.
news, or take out a kid riding his bike across the road, or something like that, something really extreme. Other people might be like, well, it's fine, nothing's going to happen. But an OCD brain will think about that. Or it could be you're holding a knife in your kitchen and you're cooking, dinner, getting dinner ready, and then all of a sudden the intrusive thought comes in that you're going to stab someone.
Oh,
And it's not that
wow.
you want to. It's not that you want to. It's just that this is an intrusive thought that comes in and you freak out. And so what you do, you avoid knives, or you make sure nobody's allowed it in the kitchen because you can't trust yourself. But it's not so much about trust. And you're not going to do it. It's just the intrusive thought. And so there's other ones around religion. If you don't excessively pray, for example, that bad's going to happen to you, your family, or whoever. You're not going to get in heaven. Or I'm not religious. I don't really understand a lot of that type of stuff, but that's the general concepts. There's one around pedophilia. So there's a pedophilia OCD, and so it's the obsessive thought that you're a pedophile or that people are going to think you're a pedophile. And so if you think about maybe a parent that has that, I don't have that one, but if you have a parent who needs to take their child to a public toilet because they're at the park and their child needs to go to the toilet. Maybe it's this obsessive fear that other people are going to see you as a pedophile because you're taking a child into a toilet, you
Hmm.
know? And so imagine that. So imagine not taking your child to the toilet because they really need to go. but but your OCD is stopping you doing that. You're avoiding the action of going, or you're diverting it. So you're actually saying to your partner or a friend, "Can you take my child to the toilet? Because I can't." So you start negating your parental responsibility. So that's another example of OCD. So they can be very extreme, and it's not just about liking things neat and tidy. And there's certainly a symmetrical one where you have to have things in a certain spot, certain order, and so forth. But again, this is where ERP is so useful because we can name it. We can go, okay, this is OCD, and this is what's going on. And so we're trying to do is just prevent those responses. So prevent you not taking your child to the toilet. Like actually take your child to the toilet. That's a normal thing to do. Like it's an okay thing to do. Or hold the knife and let someone come into the kitchen. Or put your hands in the dirt and get them contaminated. Like these are the things that we're allowed to do. These are normal things. And so it's more around preventing that response. And because the
Oh.
obsessive thoughts will come in, and then what that does is it dampens the thoughts because over time your thoughts can go, oh, actually Simon's not responding to these thoughts.
Mhm.
Maybe then it's okay. And I think over time maybe I realized that I wasn't going to lose my voice
Mhm.
if it didn't harm every minute. And maybe I told my brain, you know what, I don't need that. I'm fine. I'm okay. And a lot of that comes with wisdom. And as you get older, it becomes a bit easier. But for some people, it doesn't. And so I'm just very lucky that I've been able to move into thriving mindset as opposed to surviving because I can see these things. And I think social work certainly helped me put things into context and working in the mental health space as well. But
Yeah.
also just opening up in the first place and talking because
Mhm.
for a long time I internalized it. And a lot of us do, and particularly guys, we internalize it. We try to outthink it or outfigure it, or we just bury it deep down. But actually talking about it helps you
Mhm.
go, oh, this is just a mental health condition. These are
Mhm.
just words in my head. They're not reality. And I can actually move through this. I can get tools through this with the
Mhm.
support of a professional, but often even just with the support of a loving friend or a family member who can just go, you know what, that doesn't sound right. You humming to yourself.
Mhm.
What's going on there? Can we have a chat? And so, yeah, it is often misunderstood, but there's certainly ways to get through that as well.
Do they have medication for OCD? I've never really did the study into OCD. Do they have medication for that or?
Um, Well, I guess it comes under those. No, I don't think specifically. I mean, I don't know specifically. No one's ever said, Simon, you've got OCD. Here's an OCD medication.
Medication.
I think medication is unique to the individual, and it depends on what's going on. And so, like, I'm on a anti-anxiety. It could be even an depressant type drug. I've been
Mhm.
on like 10 or so different ones, and I'm trying to find the right one that fits. I think I finally landed on that. It's taken a long time
Mhm.
because there's a lot of side effects as well. I had this great chat with a GP recently, and he said, Simon, like, we're taught that if you've got this presenting issue, and it's usually depression, here's some
Mhm.
drugs for this particular issue. And also, that's going to create some side effects. So we're going to give you another drug to combat the side effects of that one. And then that one creates side effects and so forth and so on. So finding the right med can be really difficult. I know some people, they're in the modern modern medicine. They're looking at more medicinal cannabis as well.
Mhm.
This kind of thing. You're seeing a lot more in the psychedelic space. That's probably more for PTSD and stuff like that. But whether or not it's for OCD, it could be useful. I'm not sure. But it really depends on the person. And for a long time, I was drinking, which was negating the impact of the medication as well. Because you often get your medication that says "do not drink" when you're taking this, and I would ignore that because drinking would obliterate everything, but it was just amplifying it the next day.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it really just depends on the person as to what type of medication is going on, but and also like what else physically is going on as well. Because if we
Mhm.
start taking medication for say OCD, how does that impact the rest of the body? And
Mhm.
particularly for guys, some of the common side effects are things like, weight gain is been huge. So my weight blows up and down.
Yeah.
You lose sex drive, so it
Mhm.
feels like nothing's working downstairs, which then impacts your relationships and so
Mhm.
forth. It can create brain fog, and that's what it's trying to alleviate is brain fog, but it can also create it. Huge drowsiness, like I'm on one at the moment that can knock you out pretty much once you take it at nighttime.
Mhm.
So there's a whole range of different side effects, depending on the medication you take, and also depending on the prescriber's awareness of
Mhm.
mental health. Because I've been to different GPs and psychiatrists, and I mean psychiatrists are trained in the mental health space, but GPs are generally your first person to go through, so your general practitioner, and not all of them are into mental health, and so they don't really understand which ones are the are worthwhile for mental health conditions. Um, and so you finding that GP, and I've got one who specializes in men's mental health or mental health, is really useful because they've got a bit more awareness of the current trends in medication as well. So they're constantly evolving. So in a long way, no, there's not a specific one that I know of for OCD, but there probably is something out there. There's probably more in that anxiety style medication. So
Gotcha, gotcha. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your very own podcast. Can you tell us a
yeah.
little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Mindful Men podcast came about, through my burnout story. So in 2020, with this desire to start sharing, and the first few episodes are, episode around OCD, what it's like to live with OCD, and there's one around what it's like to live with depression and anxiety and burnout, and what it's like to be a man with mental health conditions. And so it comes out weekly, and I talk to guests from all over the world about a lot of different stuff. So not just mental health, but a lot of it is mental health inspired.
Mhm.
But it's around fatherhood and careers, finances. And the idea is it's just meant to help guys to become more mindful about their lives. So to switch off autopilot and switch on conscious living. And so we do that by talking about a range of different topics. I've even had he's 7 now, but I had my 5-year-old son Gus come on at the time. So we had
Oh
a chat
wow.
about what it's like to be a 5-year-old, which was funny because he's a chatter, he talks and he jokes. As soon as he came on the camera and had the mic in front of him, he went very quiet. So I said, "Mate, you've got to talk. This is a podcast. You actually have to use your voice." But as soon as we stop recording, he starts talking again. So he's keen to come back on as now a 7-year-old. So maybe we'll see an episode with him soon. But yeah, it's just it's a podcast to inspire guys out there to just reflect in, go, you know what? If Simon can talk about these troubles, I can talk about it too. Or if this guy from across the world is talking about this, I can talk about this too. I've got a really good, interesting one coming up around grief and miscarriage. And
Oh.
I've never really spoken about my miscarriage story with my wife. And so I've started opening the door on that. And so it enables me to talk about some things that I've never really spoken about too. And more recently, there's been a few episodes around me getting sober. And this has been a really interesting one because I've been doing the podcast for about 2 years. And so discussions around men not drinking is a really powerful conversation at the moment because in our culture here in Australia, it is very much a drinking culture. So if you're not drinking, there's a lot of questions. Why aren't you drinking? What's wrong with you? What's going on? And so there's a small movement of guys who are, going, you know what? I don't need the drink anymore, or I don't want the drink anymore. So this is creating some really cool conversations in the
Mhm.
drinking space. But yeah, that's the Mindful Men podcast. Every week we drop it on Tuesdays. Um, Random topics. Next week's we've got, depending on when this comes out, but in the next couple of weeks we've got one, a guy running from Brisbane to Sydney. That's 1,000
Oh.
kilometres, with the aim of raising awareness of men's mental health and mental health more broadly. So that's a really cool conversation coming up on the Mindful Men podcast.
Nice. I love what you're doing, helping men because men need the help. I've dated a few men and y'all need help. No, I'm just joking. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But so where can my listeners find your podcast? Where is it streaming on?
Yeah, so it's basically anywhere you find podcasts, pretty much. It's also on YouTube as well. But if you go to the website, and you've got the website up at the moment, so it's all the W's, it's mindful-men.com.au. And if you scroll right down to the bottom where we just were, it's got a link on to some of the major podcasts, so it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. I do daily shorts on TikTok as well, where I just capture it's part of the conversation and put that up there as well. But yeah, it is spread pretty broadly, so it's pretty easy to find the Mindful Men podcast.
Nice, nice. So do you do, you say you do therapy sessions with men as well?
I certainly do. So as a social worker, I do therapy. So at the moment, it's one-to-one therapy. It's like going to see a psychologist or a counselor, but I'm just a social worker. I
Mhm.
love being a lived experience therapist, so I talk about some of this stuff within my sessions if they're relevant. It depends on what the client's going through. But soon, as this business evolves, I'm going to look into coaching as well, which opens up the door to international clients as well. So at the moment, I only practice in Australia. But yeah, certainly in the future, we're looking at to open that up with a coaching program that would be available to people worldwide. And so that's in progress at the moment. I'm just developing that at the start. So yeah, we'll keep watching this space for opening it up to an international audience.
Nice. I'll definitely be sharing on my podcast as well. I do want to help more men and let them know that it is okay to share their story.
Mm.
So definitely be sharing it on mine.
No, thank you.
And my last question before I let you go is what advice would you give men who were in your situation? Like in your
Yeah, I love this question because it fires me up. It gets me really excited to hopefully inspire a guy out there to recognize, and this is the first part, is that it's not weak to speak.
Mhm,
That is actually it's a strength, it's courage, it's doing something good for you and others around you. Because once we start speaking, and you've
mhm,
just heard me ramble on for 40 minutes or so, like it becomes easier and easier the more you do it. And then you start to feel better. You don't feel like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. So just recognize that it's not weak to speak and then start a conversation and find that right person, whether it's a family member, a friend, or if you don't feel like you can get the best, and you're not looking for them to be a therapist, you just want to start the conversation, start downloading, I like to call it, downloading what's going on in your brain. But if you don't have one of those people, go and see your GP, your doctor, and have a conversation with them saying, I'm having these thoughts or feelings. Um, I'm drinking too much or taking drugs or I'm doing whatever behaviors you're doing, can you help me? And they can maybe, you might need medication or it might be a referral to a psychologist or a social worker, counselor.
mhm,
Um, Start working on yourself because often when guys work on themselves, that means getting a carton of beer, either going fishing, camping, or to the pub and
mhm,
just drinking your sorrows away. What that does is it puts a band-aid on things. It never fixes it. But if you invest that same amount of money into a psychologist session or a session with a counselor or a social worker, you get longer term fix from that. It's no longer the band-aid. You can start to peel the band-aid off and actually heal the wound underneath.
mhm,
And so that's what it is. Invest the money into yourself because that's worth it. It's better than buying a flash new car, or you don't need the new clothes or whatever. Like you don't need to look fancy. You just need to start working on you. And once that happens, growth is just amazing. You can feel better. You can maybe have a better career, better relationships with your partner or your kids or whatever, with your mates as well. And sometimes that might be evolving your social circle. So actually, like if someone's dragging you down or you can't get past that American Pie mindset with your mates, like I was in, you need to maybe evolve those, circles as well. Hang out with new guys that are into well-being or into therapy or into yoga or Pilates or sharing and going deep and stuff like that. And the personal growth that you get is just exponential the more you work on yourself. And we don't have to change overnight. It's just 1% better every day. So
mhm.
it starts internalized. We starts with that recognition within, and then the growth comes from externalizing that with safe people. And then, yeah, evolving our social circles so that we can continue growing into the men that we know we can be and the men that we want to be.
Yes, that's really great advice. I want to thank you so much, Simon, for being a guest on my podcast today.
Oh, Brooke, thanks so much for having me and having a discussion around men's mental health. As you said earlier, like it's not many guys like to do this, but I love doing this. So I really appreciate you having me on and sharing my story.
Yeah, thank you so much. You have a great day.
You too.
Bye bye. Hey everyone, thank you all so much for listening to my interview with Simon. If you would like to go visit his website, and if you're a man and seek therapy, you can go on his website. It's mindful-men.com.au. And he's in Australia, and he has a podcast as well, and there's courses. So yeah, check out his website, and I would definitely be sharing more men's mental health on my podcast because I'm all for men's mental health. So definitely will be sharing his podcast on my podcast. So I hope you all check it out and have a great day, and thank you all so much for listening. See you next time. Bye.